There is one SOE operation that post-war histories describe in a paragraph and move past quickly as if something embarrassing had been left in the room. The weapon was a dead rat packed with plastic explosive, designed to be shoveled into a German furnace with the coal. Not one device ever detonated, and yet Germany redirected industrial labor across occupied Europe for months, searching coal piles by hand. This is documented in wartime intelligence files that stayed classified for decades. The man who built the rat, and what Britain discovered when Germany found one, is the story almost nobody tells. To understand how a dead rat became one of the most disruptive weapons deployed against Germany's industrial base, you have to go back to where it was built. Not a government ministry, not a weapons factory with guarded perimeters and official requisition orders. A converted country house in Hertfordshire, staffed by men and women who did not discuss their work even with their families. The Special Operations Executive was created in July of 1940 on direct order from Winston Churchill. Its mandate was exceptional and its authority irregular. Churchill wanted an organization that could conduct sabotage, subversion, and irregular warfare across occupied Europe without the constraints of conventional military doctrine. His instruction to its founding directors was brief: set Europe ablaze. The SOE operated outside the normal chain of command, recruited from wherever it found the right combination of skills, and was given license to pursue methods that no existing military framework had anticipated. What it required above all was weapons that did not appear in any official catalog. Station 9 was where those weapons were made. Its official designation concealed its function entirely. The facility's working name was the Frythe, a requisitioned Edwardian country house near Welwyn Garden City, about 20 miles north of London. By 1941, it had been converted into a technical research facility unlike any other in British military service. The former drawing rooms held machine lathes and chemical workbenches. The corridors carried the smell of solvents. In the grounds, engineers tested devices against improvised targets, representing railway junctions, fuel stores, and industrial boilers. The classification level at the Frythe was absolute. The people who worked there would hold its secrets for the rest of their lives. The problem they were solving was access. Germany's war economy ran on coal. The Reich's factories, power stations, railway depots, and the heating systems of every occupied industrial district depended on coal-fired boilers, thousands of them, distributed across a continent. Destroy a boiler and you halted a production line. Destroy the boilers of a power station and you interrupted manufacturing across an entire district for weeks. The strategic value of boiler room sabotage was not in question. The difficulty was getting to the boilers. German industrial facilities were guarded. The approaches were controlled. An agent who penetrated a factory perimeter still had to place an explosive device against heavy machinery without being observed, which, in a facility running continuous shifts with security personnel on rotation, was a problem of prohibitive difficulty. The SOE's technical division had already developed one partial answer. Explosive coal, blocks of plastic explosive cast shaped and painted to resemble lumps of coal, could be introduced into a German fuel shipment. When the stoker shoveled his furnace load, the block went with it. The heat triggered the charge. The boiler was destroyed. It was a workable solution with one persistent limitation. A lump of coal that looked slightly wrong, fractionally too dense, fractionally too regular, might register to a stoker who handled coal as the primary material of his daily labor. The human eye, trained by repetition, develops instincts that are difficult to defeat. Explosive coal required the device to go unexamined. That was not always guaranteed. The rat came from a different direction entirely. The rat was not the product of an eccentric idea. It was the product of a systematic analysis of German factory behavior. The men at Station Nuns understood that industrial security depended on human habits, and human habits, especially under the pressure of wartime labor shortages, were remarkably consistent. Workers on 12-hour shifts did not inspect every object in their environment. They processed it, A dead animal in a fuel store was processed, removed, and discarded. What they discarded it into was determined by what was immediately available. In a boiler room, what was immediately available was a furnace. It was the autumn of 1941, and the room had once been a drawing room. The bench against the far wall still bore faint marks where a piano had stood. Overhead, a single electric fitting, a lamp angled to the work surface. A man sat on a wooden stool, elbows on the bench edge, his attention entirely on the object in front of him. The rat was approximately 9 inches from nose to tail. He had sourced it through channels that no one in the building had inquired about. On the bench beside it, a block of PE, plastic explosive, pale, workable, faintly tacky, and a scalpel he had already used to open the animal's ventral surface and remove what needed removing. He pressed the explosive into the chest cavity with 2 fingers, working it against the rib cage's interior until the animal's external profile was restored. He did not hurry. He had time. He was thinking about a German stoker, a coal shovel, a furnace grate. He was not thinking about anything else. The rat solved what the coal block could not. A dead rat found near a fuel store in a German factory or railway depot was not cause for alarm. Rats were common wherever human activity produced warmth and food waste. A stoker who found one near the coal bunker would pick it up and dispose of it without breaking his rhythm. The nearest disposal point in a boiler room was the furnace. It was the only disposal point a working man with a shift to complete would use. The behavior was instinctive, unremarkable, and automatic, which was exactly what the device required. The device required no insertion against a specific target, no moment of exposure, no skilled agent to place it. It exploited a behavior pattern so embedded in daily routine that it had never been conceived of as a security vulnerability. Mundane. That was the point. The construction demanded precision of a particular kind. The rats had to be genuine specimens. An artificial substitute would not survive casual handling. A dead rat carries a specific weight distribution and a flexibility that a fabricated object, however carefully made, could not replicate in a man's hand. Real rats were sourced in quantity and eviscerated through the ventral surface. Each was packed with a charge of plastic explosive size to disable a medium industrial boiler. The fuse assembly was calibrated to trigger at furnace temperatures, roughly 600 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and not at the temperatures encountered in storage or transit. Each completed device was sealed and stitched to preserve the animal's external appearance. It weighed what a dead rat weighs. It looked and felt like one. The assessment at Station 9 in early 1942 was that the device was ready for operational distribution. A quantity had been manufactured and prepared, each specimen processed and packed individually, then grouped into consignments for transit. SOE resistance networks across occupied Europe had been identified as the delivery mechanism, with agents positioned in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. Priority targets included power stations supplying the Ruhr, locomotive maintenance depots, and coal-dependent munitions works. The consignments would travel through the same courier channels used for other SOE materiel, the routes that had moved explosives and wireless sets and forged identity papers across occupied territory since early 1941. Nobody at the Frythe expected anything remarkable to follow. But a shipment was about to leave England for France, and somewhere between the laboratory and the continent, Germany was going to find one. The first operational challenge was not engineering, it was zoology. Station 9 required dead rats in quantity, enough to test, calibrate, and pack across multiple consignments for distribution across occupied Europe. Sourcing them presented a problem that no military requisition form had ever contemplated. The rats had to be recently dead and physically intact. Body cavities had to be usable. Skin had to be undamaged. They had to be of sufficient size to accommodate the charge and fuse assembly without distorting the animal's external profile. And they had to be obtained without attracting the kind of attention that a formal, large-scale request to a commercial pest control supplier might generate in wartime. The solution, characteristically, was informal. Specimens were collected from farms, factories, and urban premises through arrangements that no one in the building committed to paper. By early 1942, a working stock had been assembled at the Fryth. The numbers were not large by conventional munition standards. They did not need to be. The quality of each specimen was examined before it was accepted for processing. A rat that had been dead too long or whose body had sustained damage that altered its external form was discarded. The device's fundamental logic rested on a single premise, that it would be picked up and thrown away without examination. That premise held only if the object felt and handled exactly like what it appeared to be. Each processed specimen was checked for weight and flexibility. The ventral incision line was inspected by touch and eye to confirm it would not be detected under the handling of a man clearing something off a floor. The stitching was done with material fine enough to be missed in that context. The fuse assembly sat inside the chest cavity without producing any visible protrusion. Each completed device was stored at the Fryth under standard ammunition security conditions until it was cleared for transit. Ready. That was the operative word. Transit was its own problem. The rats could not simply be parceled and sent. They were moving through occupied territory, through customs and security checkpoints that German military authorities operated continuously on the roads and railways of northern France and the Low Countries. By 1942, German occupation security had considerable experience identifying SOE materiel. The devices had to be packaged in a way that concealed their nature. They also had to move through courier chains already under pressure. SOE's standard approach was to embed consignments within larger shipments of ostensibly legitimate goods, using the cover networks maintained by resistance contacts across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Individual devices were wrapped and packed in small quantities. The logic was containment of risk. No single interception should compromise more than a fraction of the total. The specific target for the first consignment is not confirmed in the available record. What is established is that the devices were intended for a facility in German-controlled industrial territory in northern France, a coal-fed installation. A resistance contact with the access and cover necessary to introduce the device without detection had been identified and briefed on the method. The route had been planned. A delivery date had been set. The shipment was packed and prepared. The first shipment did not reach its destination. The precise circumstances are not recorded in any document that has been fully declassified. What is known is that a consignment of rat devices in transit through occupied France in 1942 was intercepted by German security authorities. The interception does not appear to have been a targeted intelligence operation against this specific consignment. The available evidence suggests a routine security inspection of the type German occupation forces conducted continuously on goods moving through the northern French rail network. The outer container was opened, the inner wrapping was cut. The examining officer found something he had not encountered before, retained the entire consignment intact, and communicated upward. He did not treat it as a minor matter. He did not dispose of the contents. He did not dispose of them at all. The consignment was transferred to a facility with the personnel and equipment for formal technical assessment. German military intelligence maintained specialist units for exactly this purpose, to analyze captured Allied materiel and determine its origin, nature, and intended operational use. The examining officer assigned to the consignment was given a work surface, the crate, and the standard instruction to document what he found. It was a long table in a requisitioned building, and the room smelled of cold stone. He had placed a sheet of brown paper across the surface before he began. The specimens were laid out on it at intervals, each one separated from the next, as though the arrangement itself was part of the assessment. He worked methodically. He weighed the first specimen on a small field scale. He palpated the body along its full length, and the incision line along the ventral surface found itself under his fingers before he saw it visually. He made a note on his report form. Then he made the cut and removed the charge and set it on the paper beside the carcass and looked at it for a moment without writing anything. He picked up his pen. He understood that this document was going to Berlin, and he wanted the technical language to be precise. The wording mattered. Outside the room, someone walked down the corridor. He did not look up. His assessment identified the device correctly on every significant point. The specimens were genuine rat carcasses, eviscerated and repacked with plastic explosive and a fuse assembly calibrated to detonate at furnace temperatures. The design was consistent with British SOE sabotage methodology. The intended delivery mechanism was coal-fired industrial boilers. The rat would be introduced into a fuel supply, disposed of by a worker without examination, and shoveled into a furnace. The assessment noted that the fuse calibration was precise and the construction competent. Any such device placed beside a coal store would be undetectable to a worker handling that store in the ordinary course of his duties. If the consignment had reached its intended destination, detection would have been unlikely. That last point was not a minor observation. It implied that Germany's entire coal-fed industrial infrastructure, every power station, every munitions works, every locomotive depot, was potentially vulnerable to a device that could not be identified by looking at it. The document did not remain at the facility where it was written. It was forwarded upward through the German intelligence chain with a recommendation that the finding be communicated beyond the local command. This was not a security matter that the local garrison could resolve. The problem, if it was a problem, was not confined to one supply route. It was everywhere. The assessment was filed. It moved through the German command structure with a speed that reflected how seriously the finding had been taken. At each level, the document was read, noted, and passed upward. What the Reich's industrial security apparatus would do with it, how wide the response would extend, how many facilities it would touch, how many workers it would redirect, was not determined by the intelligence officer who had written it in a requisitioned building in northern France. He had done his part. The response was being prepared in Berlin. Its scale was something neither side had anticipated. The German response began not with orders to search, but with paperwork. The Reich's military intelligence apparatus processed the assessment from the examining officer and produced a formal security circular. A document that described the rat device in technical detail, included photographs of the confiscated specimens, and specified the threat it represented to coal-fed industrial installations. The circular was not an obscure internal communication. It was classified and distributed as a priority document to German industrial security authorities across the occupied territories. The content was precise. The document described the physical appearance of the device, its dimensions, its weight, the location of the ventral incision through which the charge had been inserted, and the nature of the fuse assembly. It included photographs taken during the technical assessment, images of the rat as received, and images of the charge after extraction. The instruction accompanying the document was straightforward. All facilities handling coal were to implement inspection protocols for their fuel supplies. Anything that did not belong in a coal store was to be treated as a potential threat. The distribution of the circular was extensive. It went to power stations across Germany and occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. It went to locomotive maintenance depots that serviced the German railway network, which ran on coal-fired traction throughout the occupied territories. It went to munitions factories, steelworks, chemical plants, and other heavy industrial facilities that depended on coal-fired boilers for their production processes. Each facility that received it was required to acknowledge receipt and confirm that it had implemented the specified inspection protocols. The Reich's industrial security apparatus was large and its communication channels were well established. Within weeks of the original assessment being filed, the circular had reached hundreds of facilities across an area stretching from the Atlantic coast to the German industrial heartland. The number of workers required to implement its instructions across that territory ran into the thousands. No rat ever arrived at any of them. The circular arrived instead. It was winter, and the coal pile outside the boiler room had been there since October. A worker stood at the edge of it in the gray morning light, his breath showing in the cold air, his hands inside his coat pockets, until the moment he was required to use them. He had been told to search the pile before the morning shift began, not this morning only, every morning. He had not been given a full explanation, something about an English device, a sabotage risk, a document from headquarters. But the instruction was unambiguous. Before the coal went in, the pile went through his hands. He began at the near edge, working methodically, turning lumps with his boot where he could, bending down where he could not. The coal left black residue on his gloves. He moved along the pile's full length. He found nothing. He had found nothing for 11 days. He noted this in the ledger by the boiler room door and went inside. Across hundreds of facilities, the same search was happening every day. The protocols varied. Some installations required dedicated inspection time before each shift. Some required a designated worker to monitor fuel deliveries on arrival. Some required the shift foreman to sign a ledger confirming the check had been done. What they shared was a single requirement: that a human being with a working day of limited hours spend a portion of those hours looking through coal for a dead rat. The labor cost was real. Germany's wartime industrial workforce was already stretched to its limits. Skilled workers had been replaced by foreign laborers and prisoners of war where production continued to demand them, and supervisory personnel were managing facilities that were chronically understaffed relative to their production requirements. Adding a daily inspection protocol to the routine at every coal-fed installation was not a minor imposition. At a large power station, a thorough inspection of an incoming coal delivery required dedicated personnel and multiple hours. At a locomotive depot with multiple coal bunkers and continuous fuel deliveries, the requirement was heavier still. The inspection did not happen once. It happened at every delivery, every shift change, every resupply. There was no point at which the protocol could be safely suspended, because the threat, as Germany's own assessment had specified, was a device that could be reintroduced at any time. The searches continued. They continued in German facilities. They continued in occupied French facilities. They continued at installations that had never received an SOE device and would never receive one. Not one device had detonated. Not one rat had ever been shoveled into a furnace. The operational plan had been intercepted at its earliest stage. Not a single device had reached a resistance contact. Not a single device had reached a fuel store. The entire technical infrastructure of the rat program, the sourcing, the processing, the packing, the courier chains, had produced nothing in the conventional sense of a sabotage operation. And yet, across occupied Europe, German industrial workers were spending their shifts searching coal piles that contained nothing to find. When SOE compiled its assessment of the German response, the conclusion was unusual. The operation had failed on its own terms. Every device intercepted, every courier chain broken before delivery, and it had, by any honest measure, succeeded. The German response to the knowledge that the device existed had cost Germany more than the device's detonation would have. The circular had done the work the rat was built to do. Germany had deployed its own institutional machinery against itself. The wartime records that documented this remained classified for decades. The scope of the German circular, the protocols it generated, the SOE assessments that recognized what had happened, all of it part of a body of material released only in fragments since the 1990s. What those records reveal about how a weapon achieves its effect without ever being used is the question that runs through everything that follows. Germany had implemented its response on the assumption that further rat devices would follow. The intercepted consignment, in Germany's view, was a precursor to a sustained campaign of coal supply sabotage. SOE, when it reviewed the circular, recognized that the assumption was wrong, and that it had produced exactly the disruption a sustained campaign would have caused. Neither side had anticipated the mechanism. The rat had not needed to reach a furnace to work. It had needed only to reach a German intelligence officer's desk. The rats had not needed to detonate. They had needed only to be found and reported up a chain of command by an officer who understood his job. Germany had done the rest, taking a crate of captured devices and turning them into a continent-wide inspection regime that ran for months. The mechanism was not sabotage. It was the administrative consequence of sabotage's possibility. The operation had succeeded. The men at Station 9 had built a weapon that functioned precisely because it did not need to function. No furnace, no detonation, no boiler destroyed. What they had built, without intending to, was a mechanism for deploying Germany's own industrial security apparatus against itself. And the Reich, across hundreds of facilities and thousands of man-hours spent on searches that found nothing, was only now beginning to understand how completely. The officer sat in a room that smelled of solvent and machine oil, the way all the rooms at the Freith smelled. The German circular had reached him through the intelligence chain, a folded document, several pages, with photographs printed in the slightly degraded quality of a wartime reproduction. He spread it on the desk. He did not read it quickly. The photographs came first. His device laid out on a sheet of brown paper, the charge removed and positioned beside the carcass. He recognized the photograph's subject immediately. He recognized the workbench. He looked at the dimensions recorded in the German assessor's notes and saw that they were correct. He turned to the section that described the instruction issued to German industrial facilities. He read it once. Then he read it again. He sat back. Outside the window, the grounds of the Freith were the color of winter grass. He had designed a weapon that had never reached a furnace, and it had worked. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The rat was not unique within the SOE catalog. Station 9's technical staff had produced, over the course of the war, a range of devices built on the same design principle. Each appeared to be something ordinary and was handled accordingly. Each contained the means of destruction. Explosive coal had preceded the rat. Lumps of plastic explosive shaped and painted to pass as fuel, designed to be introduced into a coal supply and shoveled into a furnace. There were explosive logs, cast to the same dimensions as firewood, used in German-occupied premises, built for the same delivery mechanism. There were explosive camel droppings, developed for use in North Africa and the Middle East, designed to be left along supply routes, where they would be ignored by drivers and vehicles moving through territory where animal waste on a road was unremarkable. There were booby-trapped German torches and cigarette cases built to explode on use. There were tire bursters, caltrops designed to shred vehicle tires on roads used by German convoys. The catalog was extensive and, in its aggregate, represented a coherent doctrine. The most effective place to hide a weapon is precisely inside a behavior the enemy already performs without thinking. What distinguished the rat from the rest of the SOE catalog was not its explosive content. Explosive coal caused the same physical damage. An explosive log served the same function. What distinguished the rat was what happened when it was found before it reached a furnace. An explosive lump of coal discovered in a German coal store was a threat that could be removed. The store could be searched, the supply verified, and the facility returned to normal operation. A dead rat correctly identified as an explosive device did not work that way. Identification did not remove the threat. It expanded it. Germany could discard a lump of coal. It could not discard what the rat's existence implied. The identification of one rat device implied that any coal supply in occupied territory might contain another. The rat could not be searched for in the way explosive coal could. It looked like what it appeared to be. The only response was an ongoing search, indefinitely. The principle this accidentally demonstrated was recognized within Allied and post-war American intelligence doctrine as a distinct category of unconventional warfare. The conventional sabotage model requires the weapon to function, to detonate, to destroy, to damage the specific target it was designed for. The disruption it causes is proportional to the physical damage it inflicts. The rat model operates on a different basis. The disruption it causes is proportional to what the enemy does in response to the knowledge that the weapon exists and has been used. If the enemy's response is well calibrated to the threat, which a responsible security apparatus would ensure it was, then the response itself becomes the primary instrument of damage. The saboteur's job, under this model, is not to detonate a device. It is to ensure the device is found in a way that generates the maximum response. The Germans found the rat device and generated exactly the response an adversary could have hoped for. The Office of Strategic Services, the American intelligence organization that preceded the CIA, absorbed the conceptual framework of indirect sabotage through its wartime relationship with SOE. OSS personnel worked alongside SOE officers in multiple theaters and observed the results of various operations. What worked was incorporated into their own doctrine and training programs. The principle that the discovery of a weapon could itself become a weapon, that the enemy's institutional response to a threat was a resource to be exploited, became an established concept in post-war American intelligence thinking. The CIA, which succeeded the OSS in 1947, developed this approach further still within its covert and psychological operations programs. The specific mechanism demonstrated by the rat, disruption achieved not through damage, but through the enemy's rational response to the threat of damage, has been identified by intelligence historians as an early practical instance of what later doctrine would classify as second-order effects in unconventional warfare. The specific officer or engineer most responsible for the rat device is not identified in any detailed public record. Station 9's work was conducted collectively and under conditions of absolute secrecy. The individual contributions of its technical staff were not separately attributed in the surviving documents. Classification suppressed individual names throughout. Many of those who worked at the Frith never publicly discussed their wartime work. What is known is that the device was developed and refined there. The small team responsible for it achieved something that no named individual matched through conventional means in the same theater during the same period. They had built a weapon that worked without working. They did so without credit, without any form of public recognition, and in all reasonable probability without knowing at the time how completely it had worked. The rat proved something about engineering and consequence. A well-built device does not become obsolete simply because its primary purpose has become unreachable. The quality that made the rat convincing, its indistinguishability from what it appeared to be, was the same quality that generated the disruption when it was found and reported up the chain of command. Good engineering does not expire with the context it was built for. The properties that make something deeply authentic and reliable in one set of conditions can produce effects that its builders never imagined. The officer who packed the first rat with plastic explosive had one purpose in mind: the heat of a furnace, a detonation, a wrecked machine. He never considered the alternative. He stood at a workbench in Welwyn, pressing a charge the size of a fist into a dead rat's chest cavity with his fingers, and he was thinking about fire. He was not thinking about paperwork. He was not thinking about a German intelligence officer opening a crate in a requisitioned building, going pale, and reaching for a telegraph. The rats never burned, but the order that followed, search every coal pile, every fuel store, every boiler room in the Reich, now consumed more German labor than any single explosion would have justified. He had designed a weapon. He did not know he had designed a rumor. Those are often the same thing.